This meeting is being recorded.
Everybody heard that, I'm sure.
Yes.
All right. All right. We know we'll have some people come in after we've started as well, but we are recording this, so we will share this as well. We're really happy. This series of Breakfast Club has been really interesting. So we usually have them in groups of 5. This is our winter one, so we're online only, so no driving, stay at home and make your cup of coffee. And here today, I'm really excited. This is the second time this week that we've had Orit present in our community. Earlier this week, she presented on how to speak to our children about mental health. And I don't have young children anymore, but listening to that session, I picked up like 2 or 3 really valuable pieces just for myself and for my practice as clergy and pastoral care as well. So really, really grateful to you, Orit. Orit is a psychotherapist in Toronto, but she's working and doing a lot of fantastic outreach in her role as a outreach
manager, yeah.
Outreach manager for JACS, JACS, which is Jewish Addictions and Community Service organization in Toronto. And what's so wonderful about this organization is you can go to their website and you can access resources right there. And through this recent outreach engagement, we're able to access in Hamilton this wonderful wisdom and learning and being able to learn more about the practices and the available resources that we have in the mental health world and the world of addiction. So without further ado, turning things over to the amazing Orit Tordjman. Good morning, Orit.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to seeing some new faces, and then I'm sure we'll see some more online. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to share my screen and then I'll share a little bit more about myself as well. All right, are we able to see that? Yes, perfect. So, hi, my name is Orit. As the rabbi so gratefully mentioned, I am a registered.
Sorry, I'm only a cantor.
Oh, sorry, as the cantor mentioned, sorry. As the cantor mentioned, I am a registered psychotherapist. I'm qualifying, which means I'm working towards my hours of my full certification in just a few months. I'm actually completing my practicum at JACS as well and doing individual counseling there, as well as groups and supporting the community. I've had a passion for working with individuals, specifically with addiction, substance use, and mental health concerns for probably as long as I can remember. I always knew I wanted to get into the helping field. But whenever somebody asks me why addiction, I actually go back to a class that I took about intimate partner violence and abuse in school, where they showed us the movie The Burning Bed with Farrah Fawcett. I believe it's a movie. I believe it was in the 80s, the movie. And it's a very strong movie, for lack of a better term. But it really focused in on the impacts of women and substance use, as well as it got me just more into research into what female identified individuals a few years ago, or probably 20, 30 years ago at this point, who were stay-at-home moms and how they typically would end up abusing vanilla, because vanilla, when it's made naturally, has the alcohol or the vodka in it. And so a lot of the time the housewives would typically end up drinking the vanilla and nobody had a clue that something was going on, because that's just what they would use to numb, unfortunately. So just research and wanting to get more into that, and of course just personal connection to addiction in my own way. And then I was like, all right, let's get going. And I worked in an inpatient rehab for about 6 years before going on mat leave and pursuing my master's. So here I am, and I'm still on the journey and learning every single day and loving it. So I know we did a presentation a few days ago. There's a few slides that may look a little bit familiar when it comes to that. But that's just the focus on the mental health and mental wellness, but we will be we will be just going through that a little bit and then continuing on with the rest. So we will be starting, as I did the other day as well, with a mindfulness practice, but I'm not going to do a body scan. I'm going to do something a little bit different, if that's okay. Just pulling up my script. All right, so I like to focus on the 5 senses as well when we're looking at some meditation and some mindfulness. So again, please make yourself comfortable, whether that be sitting down, laying down, whatever you choose at this point. If you're sitting down, just make sure your feet are planted on the ground, resting your hands in your thighs or on your desk. We're going to start to notice our breath. No need to breathe in any particular way, just bringing attention to each part of your breath, the inhale, the exhale, as well as the space in between, and bringing awareness to each one of your 5 senses, one at a time for about a minute each. The point here is to focus on the present moment of how each sense is being activated in that moment. The order in which you pay attention to these senses does not matter, but I will be guiding you today. So we're going to be starting with hearing. So let's begin to notice all the sounds around you. Try not to judge the sounds, just notice them. They are not good or bad, they just are. Sounds may be internal, like breathing or digestion. Sounds might be close by or more distant, like the sounds of traffic. Are you now hearing more than you were before? You may begin to notice subtle sounds that you did not hear before. Can you hear them now? Let's embrace it and accept them. And now we're going to go on to our smell. Now shift your attention to notice the smells of your environment. Maybe you smell food. You might become aware of the smell of trees or plants. You might notice the smell of books or paper. Sometimes closing your eyes can help sharpen your attention and heighten the sense of smell. Taste. You can do this one even if you do not have food in your mouth. You may notice an aftertaste of a previous drink or a meal. You can just notice your tongue in your mouth, your saliva, as well as your breath as you exhale. We have tastes in our mouths that often go unnoticed. You can run your tongue over your teeth and cheek to help you become more aware. Touch. You can bring your attention to the sensation of skin contact with your chair, the clothing, and the feet on the floor. You can notice the pressure between your feet and the floor or your body and the chair. You can observe temperature in the warmth or coolness of your hands or your feet. You might take time to feel the textures that you noticed by sight just a few moments ago. Or you can feel several objects on your desk to fully focus your attention to your present. Once we open our eyes, the last and final sense is seeing. Observe your surroundings and notice the colors, the shapes, the textures. If you really look and take the time, you may notice things that have gone unnoticed. Now we can just pause and be able to bring ourselves back to the current moment and to see how we're able to be present in the moment and how we're able to ground ourselves. It's funny, even just being able to remember and pay attention and take notice of these 5 senses, we often forget to do a lot of the time. And one of my favorite exercises to do with clients, if someone's currently in a crisis or just experiencing a heightened experience of emotions, is even just getting them to close their eyes. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later as well, but just taking yourself to your happy place, whether that be the beach or the mountains or the kitchen, wherever it may be, and noticing and asking yourself, what 5 senses might you notice at that time? So let's say if you are on the beach, it could be you might be hearing the waves or the ocean or the birds. And you might be tasting the salt if you went into the water and it was from the ocean. You might be feeling the sand, you might be seeing the sun, right? So there's so much that you can imagine and put yourself into that moment to help bring you back and to ground you if needed. All right, so as I mentioned before, there's a few things that'll just be a little bit of a review that we discussed the other day as well. But looking into what is mental health. So mental health focuses on our emotional, psychological, as well as social well-being. It affects how we may think, we feel, and we act. It can help determine how we handle stress or don't handle stress, how we may or may not relate to others, and how we may or may not make choices. As well, it identifies many factors that contribute to our mental health, which could include our biology, our life experiences, as well as our environment. And then if we're also looking at the difference in what is mental wellness, so according to the WHO, I went straight to the source, the World Health Organization, mental wellness is a state of well-being where a person realizes their own abilities, if they can or cannot cope with normal stresses in their lives, if they can work productively, and if they can make a contribution to their community. So, types of addictions. So we were discussing this a little bit earlier as well, but when somebody hears the word addiction, a lot of the time it ends up going straight to substances, or it goes straight to alcohol or drugs. But there's so many different types of addictions, and this is just a very basic list, but there's even more beyond this. So as we mentioned, substances, there's food addiction, there's sex and love addiction, there's pornography addiction, internet, video games, working, exercising, spirituality, pain, so the seeking of pain, as well as shopping. And again, even in each one of these are very much just umbrella types of addictions, and there's so much more underneath them. One that I can admit I forgot on the list is gambling when it comes to it, right? Gambling is also a huge addiction that's very present for a lot of individuals too. So warning signs to look out for. These are more specifically when it comes to mental health, but also with addiction, and we will break these down as well. But severe mood swings for an individual, the lacking of energy or motivation, the feeling of being overwhelmed, the inability to perform daily tasks or just a part of their daily life and routines, the thoughts of self-harm or to self or others is a big one as well, the feelings of doubt, the hearing of voices or belief that things may or may not be true, the feeling that something is just not right, and not feeling like yourself. So again, very basic signs to look out for, and these may be true for some individuals, they may be not. An individual can experience multiple, can experience none. Again, what I appreciate about mental health and addiction specifically and mental wellness is that it's going to look different for everybody. It's not cookie cutter. And that's where, when we work with clients especially, not one person's treatment and treatment plan is going to look the same, because it would be boring, but it would also be unfair for the individual, because it's not one size fits all. What might work for one person will most likely not work for the other. So it's going to look different for everybody. What is substance use? I figured I would just put in a picture because this depicts it perfectly. So as we mentioned, these are just some of the criteria according to the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for any sort of diagnosis that may occur. So it's the craving to the substance, and then again, whether it be the cognitive craving, the physical, the emotional, there's different types of cravings that may be present for somebody. The wanting to cut down or stop, but not managing to. The taking a substance in larger amounts for longer than you're meant to. So an example of this is, let's say I have a client who was prescribed medications for anxiety, and they were given a month's worth, but it's gone in 2 weeks because the individual has unfortunately made the choice to rely on the substances rather than looking at other possible techniques that or coping techniques that may or may not work for them. And again, medication can be the answer for some individuals. But if it's not working and you're needing to use more than what's prescribed, that's where, if it's from the medical side of things, you need to get your medical team involved in order to see if maybe that medication is just not right. Maybe you need something else, or you're needing just a different outlook, or needing to incorporate something else into that routine. The neglecting other parts of your life because of substance use, that comes up quite often, and whether that be neglecting work, neglecting family, neglecting your social circles, or even neglecting your self-care and your self-hygiene. So not showering, or not brushing your teeth, or not eating healthy food, or nourishing your body. So it's any sort of neglect for another part of your life. Continuing to use even when it causes problems in your relationship. So this is a big one. And again, relationships can be identified in so many different ways, whether it be a romantic relationship, family members. It could also be your work relationships, or just your any sort of social relationships that's present for you. And last and final, very basic one, using substances even when it puts you in danger. Okay. And that's something, again, that's become quite, it's again, extremely dangerous especially with a lot of substances, when you're either using more than the dose, and this is something we will discuss a little bit later as well, but also using substances that may cause more harm if you're not doing it safely. And that's where we'll look at the harm reduction, if that's something that would work for an individual down the road as well. So the 4 C's when it comes to identifying an addiction, or identifying a reliance on a substance. So craving, as we mentioned before, you're just needing that in order to help get through the day. The loss of control of amount or frequency you use, the compulsion to use, and using despite the consequences. So if we're looking at the 4 C's when it comes to it, so craving, control, compulsion, and consequences. And if you sort of check off all 4 of these things, or if an individual checks off all 4 of these things, there's most likely a substance use concern present for them. And that's where it would very much need to work with their circle of care to be able to identify that. Potential warning signs for substance use, or addiction in general. So being injured while under the influence, the feelings of anxiety, irritability, or depression, trouble thinking clearly, blacking out, problems with relationships, spending money on substances rather than food, rent, or other essentials, legal problems related to the substance use, or the loss of hope, feelings, and emptiness. So even within all of this, let's say when we look at blackouts could be a total blackout for the night if someone does end up indulging in too much of a substance, or it could be blackout of even just a few seconds or a few minutes. So there's, again, potential warning signs, and these are very much on a spectrum as well. It'll look different for everybody when it comes to it. So again, very much potential. An individual could identify with multiple of these warning signs, and they could identify with none of them. Okay. But just keeping an eye on it and knowing what the warning signs could look like is, I think, extremely helpful for anybody who may be worried, whether it be about themselves or about somebody else. This is an interesting one to me, at least. So the spending money on substances rather than food, rent, or other essentials. Something that we've even been seeing happen, especially let's say when it comes to alcohol, is nowadays it's very much accessible in the grocery store, right? So somebody might be going grocery shopping and going out with a budget, but they end up seeing the beer or the wine or the liquor, and it just they end up buying more than what they were planning to, and their budget ends up going towards the alcohol or the beer or whatever it may be at that point. And it's interesting, we're going to talk about budgeting in a little bit as well when it looks at self-care. But that's been one of the biggest warning signs that we've noticed for individuals as well. If we're looking at substance use versus substance induced. So substance use disorders are patterns of symptoms resulting from the use of a substance that you continue to take despite experiencing problems as a result. Whereas substance induced disorders, including intoxication, withdrawal, and other substance or medication induced mental disorders, are caused by the effects of substances. So a lot of the time, even breaking this down a little bit, so when we're looking at substance use concerns, it's something that it's happening due to the using, right? Whereas from something being induced, it's causing more long-term effects on the individual, and it's also end up progressing. So I mentioned this the other day as well, but the substance induced, let's say, is from using or abusing marijuana or THC, and it's starting to come out in psychosis concerns for individuals. So that psychosis is THC or weed induced, if that makes sense. So this is also a big one, alcohol use versus alcohol misuse. So alcohol use disorder, I know this looks like a lot of information, but especially when it comes to things like this, I like to very much just have the source out there and the science behind it as well. So alcohol use disorders instead of alcohol abuse, alcohol dependence, and alcoholism. So in the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders, which I mentioned before, which is the DSM-5, alcohol use disorders, which is also known as AUD, replace the old categories of alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence with a single disorder, which is known as AUD, which ranges from mild to severe for each individual. AUD is treatable, and individuals with AUD do recover, but lasting changes in the brain associated with AUD can make individuals vulnerable to relapse. Another thing to also identify with alcohol use is also the medical effects on your body, whether it be on the liver or on the kidneys when it comes to it. I'll never forget in my days within the treatment center as well, we've had quite young individuals, probably early 20s, that just due to the alcohol abuse and the alcohol use, their livers were starting to give up, and there was just liver cirrhosis that ended up happening for them. And I remember doctors saying that their livers were identifying as livers of individuals in their 60s, 70s, but the individual was only early 20s. Again, the impact of the alcohol use on the body. And then when we're looking at alcohol misuse instead of alcohol abuse, when referring broadly to drinking in a manner, situation, amount, or frequency that could cause harm to the person who is engaging in drinking, or to those around them. So for some individuals, any alcohol use constitutes alcohol misuse. Alcohol misuse can be acute. For an example, it could be binge drinking on a weekend night, or chronic, which happens as drinking associated with an alcohol use disorder. So one of the things that we do see quite a bit of is the binge drinking happening, where an individual won't drink during the week, but then once the weekend hits, it's just, let's hit the ground running. And it ends up being a pattern for them because it happens every single weekend. And even when it comes to the binge drinking aspect, we also find that a lot of individuals will end up using that when it comes to a celebration of some sort, or they're wanting to celebrate something. It could even be quite literally the kiddush every Saturday. And this is something we've been seeing for a lot of individuals as well. It's individuals that have had this pattern for years and years and years. The kiddush happens, and honestly, whether it be blackout for the rest of the day or the rest of the day ends up being a write-off, right? And then waking up the next morning with whether it be signs of a hangover or just feeling sick at that point, right? But again, it's a pattern that's been present for a very long time. So at JACS, we don't just help the Jewish community, but a lot of the clientele do identify as within the Jewish religion. And I know it's like this with a lot of religions as well, but alcohol is present a lot within the religion as well. And that's something that ends up being a concern, whether it be the wine as part of the Kiddush on Friday nights or on Purim, when it's also very much encouraged to take part in drinking. And this is something that ends up being a concern for a lot of individuals. And I'll give a little story when it comes to this as well. So I used to work at a banquet hall when I was a student, and we had couples that both identified as sober or in recovery, but they didn't want to not serve alcohol at their wedding, which I understand that was their choice to do. But they also didn't want people to ask questions. So they just brought just apple cider for themselves. So they had that in their champagne glasses, and I was serving the head table, and they said, just make sure our glasses are always full with this, so that nobody needed to ask. And they were always able to go and still do the l'chaim, right, with everybody, and that it still looked like champagne, so that they didn't have people asking questions. And that comes up a lot too. But again, alcohol is so accepted within our society, and it's so much of a norm that's been present for forever. But I think especially over the last 3 years, it's been something that we've been seeing coming up a lot more when it comes to the wine culture and having a glass of wine on a Zoom, or coming home at the end of the day and needing that glass of wine. That word need is where it ends up being a concern for a lot of individuals, the need versus the want, because the individual is needing it to cope or to numb anything that may have happened throughout the day, or is also looking forward to it at the end of the day, being like, I can't wait for my glass at the end of the day so I can just sort of relax from today, right? So it's relying on a substance that will help change and just numb any feelings that have been happening for them. So for me, that's a lot of the signs that I look out for an individual, especially with alcohol or with any substance in general, is the need versus a want when it comes to looking how to cope. So substance use and mental health, self-medication, as we spoke about before, it does not work. So if you are prescribed a certain medication, or if you start doing some research, I know Dr. Google ends up being a very good friend of a lot of individuals. So we got to be careful when it comes to it, right? Because it can be very dangerous, and it can harm an individual when it comes to it. So substance use can worsen or even trigger a pre-existing mental health concern. So this is, as I mentioned, if something is underlying for somebody, and this goes into the next one as well, of the use of drugs or alcohol leaving an underlying mental health diagnosis undiagnosed and untreated. So a lot of the time, a substance related concern may be present as an underlying concern. So an individual might start presenting with hypermanic behavior, but that could be them coming down from a substance, right? So it could, whether it be overshadow something that is actually present or amplifying something else as well. So it's just taking note of that as well. So the use of substances, as I mentioned, can mask symptoms while providing temporary relief. So yeah, it might make you feel better in the moment, but after that, let's look at what's actually happening and see the impacts of it. And then concurrent disorders. So concurrent disorders is a diagnosis of a mental health problem or concern along with the substance use diagnosis. So that's where, according to the DSM, it would be somebody who is diagnosed with substance, so SUD, so substance use disorder, along with, let's say it's anxiety or depression or bipolar. So it's an actual formal diagnosis of both together. Yes, a lot of the time one can lead to the other, but it's a concurrent disorder is when you have a formal diagnosis of both. I know it's a lot of info all at once. So here are some treatment options. Again, can work for everybody. It won't work for everybody. It's going to look different for each individual. And that's where, even when somebody calls JACS, individual counseling may or may not work for them. And that's what we work with them and through the consultation to be able to identify that. So therapy can can look like an individual, so one-on-one counseling, couples counseling, as well as family. And typically when it comes to therapy, we like to start and we prefer to start with the individual and then go into the couples and the family. And even if they're, let's say with couples counseling, there ethically should be 3 therapists involved in that therapeutic alliance. So each partner in that couple should have their own therapist, and then they should have the couple's therapist. So each one has their own, and then their circle of care would be complete with that third and final therapist. And it's important to do that because each individual has to be able to do their own work in order to be able to come and work through the couple's concerns. And it's also important to not have any barriers of possible of somebody thinking that the therapist may be biased towards one side or the other side, right? So it's like, oh, you're on their side or somebody else's or whatever it may be. So that's why it's important to have the 2 separate along with the couples one. Group therapy. So again, may support some individuals, may not support some individuals. Some individuals like to keep private. I know that I've had clients that don't want to go to group therapy within their community as they still want the anonymity and are still concerned with the stigma that may or may not be present for them, as well as the concerns of the stigma from others, but also that they put on themselves. And that comes up quite often as well. Support groups. So support groups are different from therapists, as a lot of the time support groups are typically run by a peer rather than a therapist. And then if we're looking at 12-step, so 12-step groups are more looking at the Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Sex Addiction Anonymous, Food Addiction Anonymous. So 12 steps very much work from, they have their own book and guidelines that they work with. And you quite literally go through the 12 steps, and the first step out of that is even just identifying that there is a concern. And again, 12 steps may work for some individuals and may not work for some individuals. But even with that 12-step program, there's a lot of accountability and having that support with a sponsor or sponsee within that program as well. And 12-step programs also happen in person and online. That's very much shifted a lot with COVID right now. The one thing I will say about 12 steps is that you can pretty much find it at any hour of any day and at any place in the world. I've had clients who do identify that the 12 steps have worked for them, and they've gone to Mexico and they've ended up going to a meeting. Or I've had a client that recently was in Bali, and he was like, I literally ended up meeting somebody at my hostel that I went to a meeting with. So there is that sort of community worldwide for some individuals if they're needing that and if it works for them. Intensive outpatient. So this is more if an individual ends up doing an outpatient program from a rehab perspective, and the individual ends up being, you could be going in every day and then still sleeping in your own home. So going in, attending group programs, attending therapy sessions, and then going home. Virtual outpatient is when an individual is at home doing the intensive therapy. So an example of that would be our Sex and Love Addiction program, which we have right now. And individual, it's a 6-week program, all virtual. There's 2 groups a day, 2 therapy sessions a week. So it happens Monday to Friday. So it gives the flexibility for some individuals if they're not able to go into inpatient or residential, which is the next one. Because some individuals don't have, whether it be the capacity to be able to go in or the finances a lot of the time. So with inpatient, when it comes to substance use concerns, there is the private versus publicly funded treatment options. Private options for a 30-day program can be anywhere, I would say anywhere between probably $13,000 to $14,000 a month, which is on like a very rare spectrum, up to probably $30,000 a month for a 30-day program, which I know sounds like a lot of money. And might be unachievable for some individuals, but with the private option, there is typically no wait list when it comes to it. So an individual is able to go and go and get the help and support that they might be needing the next day, or even sometimes the same day when it comes to it. Whereas the government funded ones can be anywhere of a wait from 30 to 45 days up to 6 to 9 months to wait for a government funded bed in an inpatient residential treatment center. So again, that's where it's looking through all of the options, and there's resources that help look at the different wait lists that may be present for somebody, and just being able to work through all of that. And then finally, harm reduction. So harm reduction can look different for each person, but an example of this would be, let's say I have a client who is injecting substances, so whether it be heroin or fentanyl or whatever it may be. They may not be ready to stop, and that's okay. We will meet them where they're at when it comes to it. And if it means them being provided with the needles and a clean needle to be able to inject, okay. If it'll reduce the harm of potentially getting or contracting HIV/AIDS, HIV or Hep C, then that's where it's reducing the possible future harm. So again, they're still wanting to use, but they're reducing the harm of maybe contracting another disease or anything that may be present for them. So that's where even harm reduction, I know in Toronto, they have also safe injection sites right now, where if somebody is again choosing to take part in injecting any sort of substance, that there are nurses present on site, that they will be provided with the clean needles. But if it happens and somebody does end up overdosing, that they have the medical professionals there to help hopefully bring them back if that ends up happening. So harm reduction can look different for everybody. It works for some individuals and it doesn't work for some individuals. And that's very much where therapy and just support is not a one size fits all. As I mentioned, it's going to look different for everybody. And that's where it's working with somebody to be able to see what works best and what may not work for you, which is extremely important to remember as well. Now let's look at some healthy coping techniques. So talking to somebody, it doesn't need much more of an explanation when it comes to that. Another simple one, as we mentioned, is even just taking 3 breaths to help lower your heart rate. Something that I don't actually have in here as well, for individuals that identify with a lot of anxiety or just needing to help them connect with their body. There's been a lot of studies recently having to do with the cold plunge, as people have been doing, or just indulging and putting their whole body into the cold water. Because what happens when you do that is your blood just sort of rushes to be able to cover your organs, right? And it ends up hoping to help heat that, which you focus on that rather than other things that are happening. So we've had individuals that might be going through a crisis at that time, and we just bring ice cubes to them, or even just putting like an ice pack around them. I've had other therapists tell me too, where in the middle of a group, if somebody's experiencing a heightened emotion and needing to regulate, and it was middle of winter in Toronto, they just went outside, put their feet in the snow for a few seconds and came back in. Right? So using any sort of coping technique when it comes to even focusing on that cold for a few seconds. Grounding exercises. So HALT. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired is what that stands for. And identifying if you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, and if that is what is leading or is causing you to be unregulated when it comes to your emotions, just even identifying it and hopefully being able to work on one of those things. There's the commercials that I've seen a lot on TV that have to do with the Snickers bar. I don't know if anyone's seen that commercial. So an individual presents as angry or just heightened with emotions, and someone just says, "Are you hungry? Do you need a Snickers bar?" And they end up giving them the Snickers bar. And then after they eat, they end up becoming like a small, innocent child or a baby or just a much calmer individual. So it was just identifying that they were hungry in order to help bring them and ground them when it comes to it. A gratitude list. Simple as that. Identifying things that you may or may not be grateful for every single day. Or having a gratitude journal for yourself and connecting, whether it be with your religious or spiritual community and being able to discuss that, or with just your social circle as well. And then the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, your senses, as we were talking about before. So you can be looking at 5 things that you may smell, 4 things that you may taste, 3 things you can see, 2 things you can hear, and 1 thing you can like feel, touch, right? So identifying your 5 senses and looking for moments or for things with each within each one of those. Taking part in a hobby. A hobby can be anything from dancing to knitting to cleaning, if that's a hobby for you as well, to exercising, whatever it may be. Mindfulness. So it could be a full body scan, it could be meditation, it could be yoga. That's going to look different for everybody as well. And maintaining a support system. Huge, huge, huge. And your support system could include medical professionals. It could not include medical professionals. It can include holistic professionals. It can have a spiritual aspect to it. It could be friends from when you were a child. It could be individuals you've just met. It can include your family. I'm also very much a believer that family is not by blood, it's by choice. I have individuals that I consider family members of mine that I'm not related to by blood, right? So, and they are very much a part of my support system as well. All right, so these are, as I mentioned, are just some unhealthy coping techniques. So substance use to cope and or numb, overindulging, isolation, under eating, self-harm, a lack of communication, impulsive spending, or avoidance. I don't know if you guys noticed, but I see a lot of similarities to addictions, to the list of addictions, even within this of unhealthy behaviors as well. So it's how something that is a daily practice becomes unhealthy and becomes unmanageable. All right, so types of self-care. When we hear the word self-care, a lot of the time we just think of self-care. We forget that there is so many different types of self-care, and I'm going to go through each one of these here as well to help identify them. Because again, self-care is going to look different for everybody, and what might work for somebody might not work for somebody else. I'm going to take a sip of water. All right, so the first one is physical self-care. So it involves movement, sorry for the spelling mistake there, and movement of the body, nutrition, sleep, rest, and physical touch. It could be having an Epsom salt bath. It could be getting enough sleep, could be going for a walk on the beach, possibly learning a new dance routine, or eating nourishing foods. These are all physical aspects of self-care. Psychological self-care, so learning something new or practicing mindfulness and creativity. So this could include a digital detox, learning or teaching a new skill, practicing mindfulness, reading a book, or journaling. So again, anything to help psychologically work through that as well. Sorry, emotional self-care. So navigating the emotions, managing stress, developing compassion for others. So this could be practicing gratitude, saying no. This is something that as individuals, we don't like saying no, right? And we hear happen quite often for a lot of individuals where they haven't said no in a very long time, but when they start to, it's a new concept, right? And whether it be the individual still not working through it or not knowing how to work through it, or their social circle be like, what do you mean no? You're not going to do this? You're not going to give in? A simple example of this, actually, a client of mine was telling me how they always end up being the ones called for a Shiva meal because they always have in the past. But got to the point where it was like, unfortunately, if I can't give in all the time, I can't give in all the time, right? And there was a shock when it came to it. But I supported the client and I said, you needed to do that for you, and that's a choice you made. If the other individuals are needing to get used to not relying on you for all those things, that's on them, not on you. Making time for reflecting on feelings and developing emotional literacy, being aware of your own boundaries, huge, huge, huge. okay? We often expect others to respect our boundaries, but we don't respect our own, which happens quite often as well. And practicing self-compassion, giving yourself a break when it comes to it, and knowing that things are not going to be perfect and that emotions are a roller coaster, and to embrace those and being able to identify them is a big thing as well. Social self-care. So having a supportive group and network of relationships around you. And this could be belonging to an online or in-person group or community, such as Breakfast Club, which you have here today, honoring your commitment to other individuals, asking for help when you need it, and connecting with friends and family in person or virtually. Whichever way you choose to fill your social cup, that's up to you. And others have to respect that as well. Professional self-care. So having clear and professional boundaries while living out your purpose. And this could look out for negotiating your needs with your boss or with your team members. It could be eating a nourishing lunch at work or at school, even when you're working remotely. I could say, even for myself, when I'm working from home, I sometimes forget to make myself a lunch or to have something healthy because it's just easier for me to go grab a snack. Whereas at work, I pack myself a lunch. And when I go and I have that healthy options, right? So that's something that even just prioritizing that. Having clear professional boundaries. Yes, we could set boundaries with ourselves, but if they're not communicated to the people on your team, how can we expect them to respect that? Attending your classes on meetings and meeting deadlines set out, and attending and participating in professional development opportunities if they're given to you. If we're looking at some environmental self-care, so this may involve having an organized, clutter-free space, minimizing waste, and monitoring technology use. So this could be decluttering your home and your work environment. I love decluttering. I'm in that mood right now, just packing up things to put in the donation bin. And just, if I walk into my house and I have things piled up on the stairs, it sort of clutters my mind when I first walk in too. So it's the little things like that. Recycling as you're comfortable to do so, cleaning up after a meal, monitoring technology time, or maintaining a clean and safe living environment for yourself. And spiritual self-care. So this may involve the belief and values that are important to you and guide your life, which could include meditating, reflecting in a journal, maintaining connection with a religious organization, donating to a local organization, or walking in nature. Again, there's different ways of being able to be spiritual, and whatever spirituality looks like for you might look different for somebody else. Financial self-care. So being responsible with finances and having a conscious relationship with money. So knowing when your expenses are due, because that could help reduce the stress when it comes to it. Knowing where your income is coming from. So knowing if it's going to be a paycheck to paycheck type of month, or if you're expecting whether it be a return from the government, or if you have children and there's the child care benefit. So just knowing what's supposed to come in for you, because that gives you the opportunity to budget appropriately and adjust budgets as needed. And that could even be when we're looking at the expenses. Unfortunately, in the winter, Enbridge and Hydro usually end up being a lot higher, right? So budgeting based off of that, where it's going to look different in the summer. And completing your taxes as necessary and saving money wisely if you're able to. And again, this might work for some individuals, it might not. I'm just taking note of time. So the video is about 14 minutes. I can show part of the video if you'd like, and then we can go from there. Yeah, okay. So I'm just gonna see this, open up. I think I'm going to have to share a different pause of the new share. Perfect. All right, is it a new screen now that's showing? No, okay. Is it pause? Okay. Okay, I'm just gonna press stop and open it up as a new one because that's probably gonna be easier at that point. Then I can just bring it back in. Okay, share screen. Perfect. And I believe we tested the sound as well. Now, can you see the YouTube video?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Again, so it is about 14 minutes. I will stop it halfway as well. So this is by Johan Hari. It is a TED Talk. Johan Hari identifies as an individual within recovery, but he breaks down a lot of the stigma and the myths surrounding addiction as well. So if anyone wants to watch this on their own time as well, please feel free to do so. So I will just start part of it, and then I'll probably stop it in about 5-6 minutes, just so we're able to answer questions. You can hear.
One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was just a little kid, so I didn't really understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family, including later cocaine addiction. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, partly because it's now exactly 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States and Britain, and we then imposed that on the rest of the world. It's a century since we made this really fateful decision to take addicts and punish them and make them suffer because we believed that would deter them, it would give them an incentive to stop. And a few years ago, I was looking at some of the addicts in my life who I love and trying to figure out if there was some way to help them. And I realized there were loads of incredibly basic questions I just didn't know the answer to. Like, what really causes addiction? Why do we carry on with this approach that doesn't seem to be working? And is there a better way out there that we could try instead? So I read loads of stuff about it, and I couldn't really find the answers I was looking for. So I thought, okay, I'll go and sit with different people around the world who've lived this and studied this and talk to them and see if I can learn from them. And I didn't realize I would end up going over 30,000 miles at the start, but I ended up going and meeting loads of different people, from a transgender crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see if they like them. It turns out they do, but only in very specific circumstances. To the only country that's ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, Portugal. And the thing I realized that really blew my mind is almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. And if we start to absorb the new evidence about addiction, I think we're going to have to change a lot more than our drug policies. But let's start with what we think we know, what I thought I know, right? Let's think about this middle row here, right? Imagine all of you for 20 days now went off and used heroin 3 times a day. Some of you look a little bit more enthusiastic than others at this prospect. Don't worry, it's just a thought experiment. Imagine you did that, right? What would happen? Now, we have a story about what would happen that we've been told for a century. We think because there are chemical hooks in heroin, as you took it for a while, your body would become dependent on those hooks, you'd start to physically need them, and at the end of those 20 days, you'd all be heroin addicts, right? That's what I thought. First thing that alerted me to the fact something not right with this story is when it was explained to me, if I step out of this TED Talk today and I get hit by a car and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given loads of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's actually much better heroin than you're ever going to buy on the streets, because the stuff you buy from a drug dealer is contaminated, actually very little of it is heroin, whereas the stuff you get from the doctor is medically pure. And you'll be given it for quite a long period of time. There are loads of people in this room who may not realize that you've taken quite a lot of heroin, right? And anyone watching this anywhere in the world, this is happening. And if what we believe about addiction is right, those people are exposed to all those chemical hooks. What should happen? They should become addicts. This has been studied really carefully. It doesn't happen. You will have noticed if your grandmother had a hip replacement, she didn't come out as a junkie. And when I learned this, it just seemed so weird to me, so contrary to everything I'd been told, everything I thought I knew. I just thought it couldn't be right. Until I went and met a man called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor of psychology in Vancouver, who carried out an incredible experiment that I think really helps us to understand this issue. Professor Alexander explained to me, the idea of addiction we've all got in our heads, that story, comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You can do them tonight when you go home if you feel a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's how we think it works. In the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and he looks at this experiment and he noticed something. He said, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's try something a bit different. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls, they've got loads of tunnels. Crucially, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. You go from almost 100% overdose when they're isolated to 0% overdose when they have happy and connected lives. Now, when he first saw this, Professor Alexander thought, maybe this is just a thing about rats. They're quite different to us, maybe not as different as we'd like, but, But fortunately, there was a human experiment into the exact same principle happening at the exact same time. It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen.
Sorry, I know. It's a really, really fascinating video. That if anyone has the chance to, I think definitely watch it to the end as well. I'm just going to go back into my, where is it? I'm just going back into my presentation. Why isn't it working now? There we go. Okay, so yeah, that's basically the lot of the mental health and addictions piece, but just looking a little bit into what JACS does and offers for the community as well. So we have 11 weekly support groups that we offer at no cost, and that could be from a daily meditation group, which happens at 11 a.m. every morning, 10 a.m. every morning, a women's group that we offer for women identified or female identified individuals who have been impacted by a loved or concerned person's addiction, a daily men's group for individuals who identify with any sort of addiction concerns, a youth group, which is more of a mental wellness group, and it doesn't have to be an addiction piece as a part of that puzzle, a rainbow support group, which happens once a week, and that's our only group that we have to do a screening for, just from a safety perspective, and a support system group, which happens every Thursday, and that's for any concerned person or loved one who's been impacted by someone else's addiction. And that could be a coworker, a sibling, a parent, a friend, a partner, whatever it may be. And then we offer the individual counseling. So we offer one-on-one therapy for individuals impacted by addiction, whether it be themselves or a loved one. And we work very much on a sliding scale approach. So we are fee for service, but if someone's not able to complete that fee, we will work with them and meet them where they're at. But we won't turn anybody away for financial reasons. And we also have no wait list. We keep on bringing more therapists onto our team to make sure that there is no wait list, and it is virtual. And then mental health therapy for youth. And then from outreach, as I'm doing today, we have our adult outreach, and we're expanding outside of Toronto. We have our youth outreach, where Samantha goes into our B'nai Mitzvah programs and high schools and elementary schools. And then we have our university and college outreach programs, which we've been working with a lot of Chabad and Hillels as well, to be able to expand that as well. And that's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions?
So please feel free to unmute everyone. And while we have Orit with us for the next 2 or 3 minutes, do you have any questions? Mark.
This is Sandra, and I do have something to say. When the pandemic first started, Jewish Family Services, Hamilton, started a program, Seniors Without Walls, the dial-up program called the Kibbutz Corner. And they had different individuals doing programs. Well, one of the individuals did mindfulness and meditation. And this is still going on today, and people dial up for it. Also on their staff, they have an individual that's experienced with mental health. So if anyone has any mental health problems or questions, they could turn to that individual.
Yeah, we're actually having a meeting with I'm coming down to Hamilton in a few weeks as well. We're going to work on hopefully developing and expanding their addiction and mental health programs as well, and what's offered for the community. They are a fantastic resource, and I know they're wanting to grow and help support the Jewish community in many more ways as well.
Lovely. Mark and Hinda.
Yes, I enjoyed your talk a great deal. I have a kind of a comment, and then I'd ask you to comment on it. There's a role for public policy in this, and today, as you know, or you don't know, there's a Super Bowl at 6 o'clock, and every 3 minutes there's a commercial. And either you're going to see a macho truck being advertised or sports betting. And every time I see sports betting, I go absolutely bonkers, because it is a form of addiction. The government is actually sanctioning it, or they're approving it. The NFL is approving it because it's money making, and it's just so. And then you see, all these super sports heroes giving it a pat in the back. I think it is so wrong, and it's just very upsetting to see this happening.
No, I thank you for bringing that up, and I agree. There's so much out there that's, I'm going to use quotations, quote unquote, legal, but that ends up being very dangerous for individuals, right? And whether it be gambling or alcohol, right? Having the LCBO, or over the pandemic, having Uber Eats deliver alcohol, or THC weed becoming a lot more accessible for individuals, right? It's scary, for lack of a better word. It's scary how accessible giving into an addiction has become. And that's where it's funny, not funny, but when looking at gambling, even the casinos is one of the only places where you can put yourself on a ban list. I don't know if you know that. So I know individuals,
What do you mean by that? What is that?
You can go and actually get them to ban you from allowing, because you have to show ID going into the casino, right? So you can put yourself on a list for a year. And from what I know, you can't take yourself off that list if someone's trying to work on that concern. But Mark, I agree with you when it comes, especially to the Super Bowl. It's not just the advertisements on TV, it's the billboards all around too, right? Or for some of the arenas, even it has like Molson, it might be on the ice, you know what I mean? So it's very much accepted within society right now as well. And that's where, for lack of a better word, the scary part comes into play, because there's a lot of individuals struggling. And when those things come up, it triggers something inside. And that's where, if an individual is struggling, it's being able to identify that. And that's where, at least at JACS, we're hoping to help with the knowledge and the education for individuals, whether it be for themselves or to help notice that in somebody else, to work through it, hopefully, if that's what they want to do.
Yeah, and if I could comment on the video we just saw, to put it in a bigger context, what he was saying was health is a balance between your environment and the medical stuff. And we see that one of the biggest influencers of health is the social determinants of health. So like, you can take really expensive drugs to deal with your heart attack or your cancer, but some people, in the northern part of Hamilton, they don't get the benefits because of their health, the poverty and the alienation. It's a much bigger detriment than you know, the disease per se. And that's what he was saying. He's basically, it's a balance. And we heard, it was very interesting. We heard in Paula's series, I think 2 weeks ago, they were talking about the psychedelic drugs and the experiments with you know, mice and psychedelic drugs. And so now the psychedelic drugs have been approved by the FDA for PTSD or whatever, but they're not approved. It's really the psychotherapy that's approved, and you can use the psychedelics over, you know, as a supplement. So it's a very complex area. So I mean, he's right. We don't quite understand it. Our daughter is who we're going to be Zooming with, our granddaughter next, is an addiction medicine physician in New York City. So she deals with the harm reduction and, you know,
and I'm sure she's quite busy.
Yeah. But interesting stories. Yeah.
For sure. And it's funny you bring up even the medication. I'm keeping it on time just in case somebody has to go. But do you guys know how fentanyl came to light?
It was
So
a
the
medical
abusing
world drug, right? Like it's
right. So, well, fentanyl itself used to be a patch, right? It used to be a gel patch that was put onto your shoulder. And what individuals ended up doing was they would open up the patch, they would scrape out the gel, dry it, and then that's what ended up becoming the substance. And fentanyl is so lethal, especially carfentanil now, but fentanyl is so lethal that even a grain of salt worth can kill you.
But Ori,
So,
you know,
yeah.
I'm a retired oncologist. Fentanyl patches were a godsend. In other words, every 3 days, they were less nausea, vomiting, all that stuff than morphine. And look, and they were really part of the armamentarium. And look what's happened. So now there's a rebound. Nobody wants to use them, et cetera, et cetera. Real pity, real pity.
Well, that could start the whole discussion too with when it comes to T3s or oxys or Valium, or do you know what I mean? It's again, that's where I was even mentioning about where if a substance that is prescribed by a doctor, you end up abusing that substance or buying it on the street or finding it in your family's closet or whatever it may be. So that's where the danger comes out as well.
As to what you touch on the TED Talk, I didn't get his name, but he talked about, well, if your grandmother goes in for hip surgery and she's given strong narcotics for the pain, she doesn't get addicted. That's not necessarily true. And so that, yes, if it's not managed properly, yes, she can get addicted. And that, which is, you know, part of where the origins of the opioid crisis, that, you know, so that, anyways, we didn't see it to the end, so we don't know whether
We're going to watch it later.
We don't know. If
I was going to say, I just shared it in the chat as well. If and I'll just put the name of it. Everything you think you know about addictions is wrong. And he actually has he's written 2 books as well, which were also fantastic reads.
That's Johan Hari, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I
Thank you. Oh, go on.
I'm sorry, you want to go ahead, finish what
It's not want to know. Everything you know about addiction?
Everything you think you know about addiction.
Okay.
This was when, it's Sandra, this was when the pandemic first started. Orthodox Jews that never pick up the phone on Saturday picked up the phone, over 200 of them, to call the mental health line for help.
The Pikuach Nefesh.
Yep.
Really experienced a need.
Yeah.
No, for
I
sure.
was fascinated through the pandemic when everything was closed and we weren't to go out, and you know, grocery shopping was an essential area where we could go out, but the liquor store was also considered an essential area. Like, what would have happened if it wasn't considered that? That's what made that's what I couldn't help thinking. Like, really, it would be so bad?
Well, even with that, so with alcohol, it's one of the most dangerous withdrawals for an individual, and it's one of the only withdrawals where somebody can die if they don't have the medical supports when it comes to it. So that's,
it was essential.
It could be for some individuals, right? But that's where I would look at it as a little bit of a harm reduction approach if somebody wasn't ready to stop, right? So
Right.
yeah.
All right. Listen, we need to
Wrap
say
up.
goodbye.
Yeah.
Next week, our breakfast club is Sandra's friend, Jacob Steinberg, and his fantastic encounter as a business person in South America with learning about the Jews of Suriname. This is just blows my mind. It's going to be so interesting to hear his story. And thank you so much, Tori. We look forward to your outreach increasing in our community. So that's really, really wonderful. I'm going to contact JACS and ask about Samantha coming to talk to our B'nai Mitzvah students as well. I think that would be lovely.
I will send an email connecting the two of you.
Lovely. Wonderful. Thank you so much to everyone who came out today.
Thank
We
you.
recorded this as well, and we'll share it on our website. All the best to all of you. Happy Super Bowl. Don't gamble. And Shavua Tov to you all.
Shavua
Take
Tov.
care.
Thank you.